Dani. I'm going to be the moderator for this event, the first of a series of readings of an anthology called My Shadow is My Skin, which is an anthology of nonfiction writing by Iranian diaspora, Iranian writers in the States. And it was published in March 2020, which is 2 months ago. I say it like it was 2 years ago. It feels like everything is just, the time-wise, it's crazy. But it was published in March, but unfortunately, because of, our current crazy times, the authors weren't able to hold the book readings that they wanted to have in person in various bookstores and so on. So they have all decided together to have these Zoom virtual readings, which I thought was a great idea, because maybe you can even get, more people listening to you from all over the world if they wanted to. So I think it's something amazing that we can do. The anthology has about 32 authors. And these authors, they are Iranians from every little possible aspects you can imagine. There are Iranians who have just recently migrated to America. There are Iranians who migrated to America in the 70s after the revolution or before the revolution. There are Iranians whose parents are Iranian, but they were born here in the States. There are Iranians who have one parent Iranian, another non-Iranian. So it's a mixture, it's a beautiful collage of what diaspora really means, and how inclusive it is, and it could mean so many things. And the authors that I have the honor to moderate today we have 4 authors. We have Farnaz Fatemi, Persis Karim, Layla Razavi, and Siamak Vossoughi. So I'm going to introduce them now and ask them each to do a reading. Then we'll go into a discussion where I'll be moderating, asking questions and so on. And eventually we will open up to Q&A so that you guys could get to ask questions too. But I do ask you to mute your microphones for when they're doing the reading and the discussion is going on, and we will let you know when the Q&A begins. And also, if this is a really, really amazing anthology, and I wanted to encourage all of you to definitely get a copy, even if you can't get it now here, because we're all far away from each other. You can definitely order it online. Either you guys can hold up the book so everyone can see. Layla, Siamak, Persis, all of you. There you go. There you go. Okay, some people already have it. Great. So you can order it on bookshop.org, right, Farnaz? Bookshop.org, and on Amazon, and get your copy, read it. It's really amazing. It will make you laugh. It will make you cry, all kind of emotions. So I'm going to go into introducing the authors. Farnaz Fatemi, a writer and editor, a child of Iranian parents, was raised in Southern California in the 70s and 80s. She's a co-founder of the Hive Poetry Collective, which presents a weekly radio show, podcast, and live readings in Santa Cruz County. Her poetry and prose have appeared in Gwis Journal, SWWIM Daily, Catamaran Literary Reader, Crab Orchard Review, and several anthologies, including most recently, Halal If You Hear Me. She taught writing at UC Santa Cruz until 2018. The color of the bricks from which she will read tonight is part of a recently completed hybrid manuscript called Sister Tongue, which is currently making the rounds at publishers. Next, we have Persis Karim, who is a poet, editor, and professor of comparative and world literature at San Francisco State University, and directs Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, a research and service organization dedicated to promoting new research and programming about the Iranian diaspora. She's the co-editor of 3 anthologies of previously published Iranian diaspora literature. Layla Razavi is Deputy Executive Director at Freedom for Immigrants, a national NGO monitoring human rights abuses and working to liberate all detained immigrants globally. She previously worked for the ACLU and regularly provides testimony to policymakers and appears in national news outlets. Layla was born in San Diego to parents who immigrated from Iran prior to the revolution. She's a recovering lawyer who's very happy to be trying her hand at writing that uses her right brain. And Siamak Vossoughi was born in Tehran and lives in Seattle. He has had some stories published in various journals, and his first collection, Better Than War, received a 2014 Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction. His second collection, A Sense of the Whole, will be published in October. So as you see, we have just 4 incredible authors and people, human beings today with us. So I'm gonna go ahead and start the reading, and we'll start with Farnaz. Please, if you can say some words about what you're gonna read, and go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, Sahar, for the introduction, and I'm so glad to see everybody here. I'm going to read an excerpt from the piece that's in My Shadow is My Skin. The piece is called The Color of the Bricks. The original piece is not sequential, it's not very narrative, so I'm excerpting out of sequence from that essay. I had never been in a cherry orchard. When my uncle Reza hears this, he arranges for him, Simin, and me to drive to a friend's outside the city. We spend the morning moving from tree to tree, free to be haphazard about the harvest, to pull whole handfuls at once into our baskets and cardboard boxes, nestle them into the trunk of Reza's old pecan, to imagine that the weight of all of them brings us down closer to the earth as we idle home. I take video on my camera of our stained hands, Simin on a ladder, the lush treetops, the sounds of my lips smacking when I sample the cherries. Later, I make a short film to send to friends and family with In My Life by the Beatles as the soundtrack. In Iran, a taxi driver taught me what to look at. I see the woman at the end of the off-ramp in North Tehran, one plastic grocery sack hanging on each wrist and hair tucked into an amber headscarf. She stands on her island of sidewalk as if expecting someone, gazes into each driver, then lets go. Taxi driver says she is working. No one can accuse her of doing anything wrong. She is alone and she is standing and holding her shopping. Her body leans discreetly toward the road. I twist to look as long as I can. I want to see a slowdown, conversation, how she gets in carefully. I returned to Iran as an adult in 2001. I visited the mosque in Nain, the town where my parents' grandparents were born. How can I help you see the mosque made of bricks in this town I've only seen once, this town from which both my parents descend? If you can't see the color of the bricks, I'll be lying. You'll get to a place you think you know, not the one I know. It's the tide of your already imagined ideas that I resist. For over a decade, I have tried to explain by describing the bricks as butter yellow. Butter yellow, great aunts and uncles in the dust of the courtyard. Surely you notice, a mosque, yellow cream, earthy, rooted and rooting me into it. Nain, town of my ancestors. I could take you back 200 years. A breeze in the courtyard carries the voices of people with my name. It's a balmy spring weekday, and I'm walking with a new friend on the grass-lined path next to the Zayanda River in Isfahan. Hundreds of people on either side of this urban river are doing the same. In front of us, 2 men lock arms and clasp their hands as they cross the Siosepol Bridge, disappearing into the line of people and 33 stone arches. I think of fatwas. I think of the rules this breaks back home. 2 men, fond of each other, announcing, "We're friends." I am trying to explain what it feels like to have not come from a place and to have come from the very same place. I try for several months to write a poem. Instead, I write an op-ed that I never publish, but read to audiences called "You Should Go to Iran." I want to introduce Americans to the young women I meet who say they are comfortable with headscarves, to the strangers who invite Americans into their homes and feed them sweets and tea. All of this takes place in the months immediately following 9/11. I feel funneled to the center of a much bigger storm than an individual could ever quell. It feels as if I'm saying the same thing over and over, "Don't ruin my country," except that I stumble on the word "my." It isn't a lie. Iran will continue to stake out space in my internal life, but it isn't accurate. I have the choice to defend Iran, and I suspect I could get away with not doing so, but that's probably not true. In my heart, I know Iran owns me.
That was beautiful. I loved it. It's very touching. Thank you so much, Farnaz. The next person reading is Persis. You're on mute, I think.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I see friends, colleagues, and students. So thank you for coming. And thank you, Sahar, and to my fellow authors. Thank you very much. And a big shout out to Layla and Catherine, who edited this collection. It's a lot of work to be the editor of an anthology, and they did a really superb job. So thank you to both of you. This is called In Praise of Big Noses. If you're not familiar with Iranian culture, the aesthetics of beauty have been very much influenced in the 20th century by the idea that women should have their beautiful big eyes and long eyelashes, but they shouldn't have the big noses they were given. So this was inspired by a long struggle to accept my nose. Until my adolescence, I avoided thinking about my nose. As a child growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area suburban town of Walnut Creek, I was aware of the ways that my difference was cast in both my name and my appearance. Beyond the constant butchering of my first and last names, Paris, Persis, Pierces, I often faced that singular question, where are you from? I had inherited most of the features associated with my father's appearance: large brown eyes, thick dark hair, long eyelashes, plentiful eyebrows, and olive-colored skin. My mother was from France, but she too had dark hair and brown eyes. Although my father was a handsome man, his exceedingly large nose and well-sized ears were an inescapable part of his distinctively non-Anglo foreign look. When my father's two daughters, my half-sisters, came from Iran, I was still a young girl. I could see in their faces something of how they resembled and didn't resemble me and my sister. But as my sister Avesta approached her teen years, I began noticing her increasingly self-conscious comments about the size of her nose. My father's sister and her three daughters had come in the early 1970s from Iran. And at various family gatherings we attended at my aunt's house, I noticed women, some my cousins, others friends of my aunt, who came to her Nowruz parties with bandages on their faces. When I was about 11 or 12, I finally mustered up the courage to ask one of my cousins what was going on with the large white bandages across the woman's face and the black and blue bruises under her eyes. She leaned into me and whispered, "They've just gotten their noses fixed. It's a nose job." I had seen enough to surmise that it was an Iranian female practice that might one day be visited upon me, but I hoped I would be spared the seemingly regular female rite of passage. Later, when I asked my father about these women's wounded faces, he blurted out, "Well, my dear, in case you hadn't noticed, we've got a few people in this family with pretty big noses." He smiled and pointed to his own. As a teenager, I became aware of the bountifulness of my proboscis and wondered if I would be next. I was processing how much more beautiful my half-sisters were, and I did want to look like them. Without ever asking them or speaking about it, I knew that they had participated in the same ritual of nose reduction. Theirs were petite and well-proportioned noses, even a bit Anglo-looking. One of them even had a slightly turned-up nose, one that looked far more like Audrey Hepburn's than my Barbara Streisand budding nose. The contagion of nose reduction operations in my extended family seemed more and more prevalent with each passing year. First, it was my oldest cousin, then her younger sister, then a sister-in-law, then the daughter of my father's distant cousin. It was the mid-1970s when Iran and the United States were close allies, and when there was relative ease of movement between the two countries. Plastic surgery had become a big business in Iran. The influx of Western culture and the importance of beauty products from the United States, and as well as the influence of movies and television, had transformed the landscape of aesthetics and beauty in that country. Iranian women sought to be more beautiful by bleaching their hair blonde, fixing their noses, wearing shorter skirts, and they seemed to bring that aesthetic with them when they emigrated to the United States. Iranian women were beautiful to me, but apparently they wanted to be just exotic enough, with large brown eyes and voluptuous lips, but with small, perfectly sculpted Anglo noses. Some of these noses were petite and perfectly triangular, while others were slightly upturned, like my sister's. Mostly I noticed that these noses all looked alike, as if they'd been reworked by the same plastic surgeon who'd taken away nature's unique character from each of their faces. But I also noticed how much their noses looked different from my own, and it began to bother me. Around my 15th birthday, during that awkward phase when my adolescence features appeared scarily large and unsettled on my still childlike face, I realized I was being recruited into this cult of Iranian beauty. The first occasion was at my aunt's house when she told me that I should pluck my eyebrows a certain way and put on makeup, and then followed that with a casual comment that I should get my nose fixed so that I could become more beautiful. On another occasion, my sister Lily gave me a lesson in upper lip depilation and gently suggested something similar. You're beautiful, you know, but we Karims, we have large calves and large noses. You can't do anything about those calves, but the nose, you can fix that. Several months after this conversation, I became more aware that the odds were against me. I overheard my sister Avesta speaking quietly behind a closed door with my father about his offer of financial support so she could get the operation. It was sometime around her 22nd birthday. I knew that she'd felt increasingly self-conscious about her nose, and though she possessed some of my mother's features, much fairer skin, lighter hair, as well as my mother's very petite build, and she had the gene for green eyes, her nose was decidedly a carbon copy of my father's. In the days after her surgery, I saw her only once in the white bandages and with the black and blue lines under her bright green eyes. I remember that for the most part, she retreated to her apartment to recover and heal. We didn't see her again until a month had passed. She came to the house and without saying a word, showed off her new nose as if it were a brand new car. Her new nose seemed to make her happy, and she now held her head high. I remember how it struck me as odd. I wanted not to feel the pressure to do the same thing. But for her, the operation had been a double success. She was more aesthetically aligned with American beauty norms, and she had, in effect, eradicated her Middle Eastern heritage, a part of herself with which she was never comfortable. She also participated in a rite of passage that she shared with our two other sisters. And despite our age difference and her emotional distance from them, it was a way she belonged and I didn't. I was now the only one with my original nose. I managed to avoid the topic of the nose job until around the time I turned 17, when my father, who was acutely aware of the long-standing tradition and the rising costs of the operation, asked me if he should put aside some money for this. He told me that along with savings he's been putting aside for my college education, he'd save some money for that in case I wanted to join my sisters in the nose reduction club. Although I appreciated the gesture, deep down, I was distressed by his offer. But do you really think I need one? Do you think I'm not beautiful enough? I asked. He laughed and responded by saying that I looked like him and that as his daughter, I would always be beautiful in his eyes. But do you think I have such a big nose? I pleaded again. Your nose is a smaller version of mine, he said. And in an unusual philosophical and pragmatic way, he followed by saying, I regard the nose as a sign of character, and on you it is part of the total aspect of your beauty. But what is inside you is ultimately what determines how others will see you. You are beautiful, my Suski, his nickname for me. But it's up to you to decide if you want this or not. I was relieved that he didn't pressure me and that he allowed me to consider the decision myself. My mother never said a word about it. After thinking about it for several months, I decided to pass on the nose job and instead took the money that he'd put aside for me and used it as a trip to study abroad in my senior year of high school. I was aware that I was making a choice, an intellectual and what now seems like a feminist choice, that would set me apart from my sisters and some of my other female relatives. I was both proud and a little ambivalent about the choice I had made, but I had decided that I would resist the trend and hope that my other attributes would compensate for my nose's largesse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Almost surreal, this story. I loved it. Okay, so next we have Layla Razavi to do the reading.
Thank you so much, Sahar. Thank you for hosting this conversation for us. And before I start, I'd also like to thank Layla and Catherine as well for not just putting together this really beautiful anthology of work, but for allowing me the opportunity to share my story among such esteemed writers. So my story is about a relationship I had growing up with a woman who was a central figure in my life and the life of my family. In the 50s and 60s, it was very common in Tehran for families to have live-in domestic workers who helped raise the children in the household. One of the things, though, that was unique was that my mother's family was able to bring theirs back to the US with them when they immigrated. So I grew up having a very special bond to this person, and the story involves a number of time jumps as I sort of start to realize who she is and build my own identity and relationship with her. With that, I guess I can begin. Biainja, Zahra screeched, cupping my face in her hands and pulling me toward her. I could see strands of chewed up sabzi, cilantro or parsley most likely, hanging out from in between her teeth, and her breath reeked of raw onion. Nemikham, I groaned, trying to pull away. She planted her wet saliva kiss on my cheek anyway, ignoring my protests. I was a little girl in kindergarten, and we were making one of our regular visits from our house in San Diego to see my grandparents in Los Angeles. They were having some of their friends over for dinner, and my parents and I had arrived early to settle in and help my grandmother. I loved trips to see my grandparents, but I hated the drawn-out entrances and the aggressive greetings of my relatives. All the old ladies with red lipstick on their teeth trying to kiss you were tedious enough, but I always especially tried to escape from Zahra's kisses. She had long, scratchy whiskers. There were always half-eaten clumps of food in her mouth, and strange kitchen smells. Cardamom and turmeric formed a halo around her at all times. I groaned and rubbed my cheek to erase the kiss stain. My grandparents lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a 3-story Art Deco building on a quiet street in Sherman Oaks, California, in the Valley, where a large portion of the Muslim Iranian population was concentrated. I loved exploring the neighborhood with my grandparents. They didn't have a car, so we would walk around Ventura Boulevard or take the bus. The stores had signs with Persian writing hanging in the windows, and the shops played Persian music and sold Persian food. The apartment was crowded. My grandparents slept in the master bedroom, my uncle Amir in the 2nd bedroom, and Zahra on the floor in the dining room. But for a little girl, the apartment provided ample space for the imagination to run wild. I would turn the small living room into a theater hall where my relatives were forced to sit on plastic-covered furniture and watch me sing and dance. There was a small patio full of wicker furniture assembled on fake grass. Zahra would sit on the grass and spread mounds of sabzi out around her on Persian language newspapers, separating all the freshly washed greens. Zahra was an anomaly among the colorful cast of Iranian characters assembled in my childhood milieu in the valley. The other elders, my grandparents and their friends, were sophisticated. They would go to Europe or Iran and come back with suitcases full of gifts and foods. They wore too much perfume or cologne, and they threw dinner parties where they played grown-up card games like rummy late into the evening. Aside from their overly zealous greetings, they were fun. They played games with me and teased me. But Zahra didn't socialize with anyone who came to visit. She sat in the corner, often on the floor, with one leg curled underneath and the other leg bent in front of her, with her knee functioning as a makeshift armrest. She had a limited number of dresses, large patterned housecoats, and an assortment of navy blues and grays which draped over her like a tent. She was the only person who wore a headscarf. She would tie it firmly beneath her chin every morning and keep it on until she got ready for bed. Her face was constantly scrunched up tightly. It was not a scowl so much as a permanent wince. It never occurred to me to question who she was or why she was there. She was just Zahra, our nane, an odd fixture from my childhood who had always been there. The other guests started to arrive. Zahra went and took her place in the kitchen. The small table in that cramped kitchen had room for only 2 chairs. Zahra's chair was easily identifiable because the wicker seat had sunken underneath her weight as she sat in the same spot each day for hours on end. Eventually, we would have to replace the seat of the chair 2 times as the wicker strands began to fray and break. But that evening, the wicker seat remained intact, thinned and stretched down to the shape of Zahra's bottom. Outside the kitchen, the guests in the dining room were complimenting the food, and my grandmother began explaining which dishes she could take credit for and which ones were exclusively the result of Zahra's labor. As the meal wound down, Zahra brought out a tray of hot tea, and my grandmother and my mom started stacking the dirty plates to carry into the kitchen. My grandma reemerged from the kitchen carrying a green felt cloth. The card game would begin soon. This was my cue to leave. Already feeling bored and as the only child, I wandered into the kitchen. On these occasions, I didn't mind Zahra's strange smells. I walked up to her feeling listless, and without saying a word, I climbed up on her lap, her rolls of flesh shifting around to cushion me. "Qurbunet beram," she said, a declaration of her willingness to die for me. "Inshallah, you will have a husband, but he will be the best husband." She lightly tapped her finger against my pelvis from outside my pants. "We won't give this nos to some nobody. He has to be a king. We will give our daughter to the King of Kings." I smiled bashfully and she laughed and pulled me into her. I buried my face in her large breasts as her entire body shook with laughter and her eyes brimmed with tears. Zahra didn't speak any English, so sometimes I didn't fully understand her meaning, but I knew I was special.
Thank you so much, Layla. That was so sweet, beautiful. Merci. Okay, and then Siamak, if you could go ahead for the reading.
Okay, sorry. All right. Thank you so much, Sahar, for moderating. Thank you to the other writers. It's really exciting to have a chance to read with you all today. And thank you to everybody for coming. And Layla and Catherine, it's great to be with you for the 3rd time, I think, together like this. So thank you, everybody. All right, the piece I'm going to be sharing from is called The Iranians of Mercer Island. And it is a story about trying to make sense as a kid make sense of a smaller community, our Iranian American community, within the larger American community. And it's all kind of through the lens of watching the singing that would happen during the get-togethers of my parents and their friends. All right. Little by little, we began to see that the place we could have here was the place we could make for ourselves. It meant that who you were had to emerge. We owed it to one another. I owed it to the Iranians to try out for the basketball team, even though I got cut every year. Because if I did make the team, there would be an Iranian name on the back of one of the high school jerseys. Then nobody could say that we weren't a part of this place. We had a chance to show them what Iranians were, but this meant that first we had to know ourselves. I didn't know how we were supposed to do that when even the air I breathed was American before it was mine. But I breathed it in deeply until I knew that that was not true. It was mine before it was American. It needed a boy to breathe it in before anything else. It needed a boy the same way that the evening sky needed a boy to dream under it, and the stars needed a boy to wonder at them. America needed me, I thought. It didn't always know it, but in its quiet moments it did. And it needed the Iranians to sing long into the night. It didn't know it needed that at all, but we did. I didn't know how we knew, but I would listen to the singing and tell myself to remember that there was a secret knowledge in the world, something that wasn't seen in the rush of the day. But the next morning I would wake up and it would seem like the only thing secret was wondering and asking again. I didn't know how to bring that secret part of myself together with the part that knew something for sure. If I had Iran the way they did, I thought, then I would know it. I would know what longing really was. The singing always sounded very sad to me. It was the only time that I saw people making room for sadness together. In America, sadness seemed like an individual's road, and I tried to make the street behind our house that ran along the school and the fields my version of it. It was good to have a street like that. I'd walk up and down it thinking of the American girl in my class and whether she could really help me love as much as it seemed like she could. I'd come home and my mother and father would ask me what I was thinking about. But they wouldn't ask me what was wrong because the memory of the last time there had been singing in our house was still within them. They knew there was plenty that was wrong if you wanted to look at it that way. You were stuck in the business of living, and maybe that meant you were stuck living far from home, or maybe it meant you were stuck living in a world that felt too small at some times and too big at others. But either way, there was a respect for sadness because we couldn't know ourselves without it. So I listened and thought of all the things that wouldn't keep going here in America. There were a lot of them, most of them I didn't even know yet. The Iranians knew it. They didn't expect us to carry on everything. The best we could do was to be quiet when they sang, which we were. Then we would joke with one another about their extended goodbyes, full of bows and ceremony, knowing somewhere inside of us that their goodbyes would last longer than our joking. They would still have the last word. We had to joke because it softened the edges of the two sides we sat upon. Those two sides were far apart most of the time, but they were close when we were all together. And those sides were close inside me when I walked along that street behind our house. I just didn't know how they could ever be close in a way that was meant for all the world to see, like the way it could be seen in the Iranian singers. Even an American could hear the sadness of their singing. I saw it firsthand the night that the singing got too loud and one of our neighbors called the police. He was a lonely American cop who knocked on our door late at night. My father told him that we would sing more quietly, and then it felt too impolite to just send him off into the night. So my father invited him in to have some tea and listen to the singing. I was thrown for a loop because I thought that one way to be Iranian in America was to be against the agents of state control. But my father, who knew much more about agents of state control than I did, didn't care about all that and brought him in and gave him a place to sit. The Iranians of Mercer Island were very happy. It was a chance to show their lives, to show that whatever else the cop thought Mercer Island was made of, it also had this, Iranians singing in the night. It was a part of Mercer Island the Iranians had always known. They were introducing the cop to his own town, the quiet town he had been patrolling at night. I was going to have to find something more when it came to being Iranian in America than just being against the agents of state control. You see, my father told him, the singing is sad because we miss our country. I can see that, the cop said. It is sad. Yes, my father smiled and the Iranian smiled as if to say, tell us what you are sad about. Thank you, the cop said. I hope you can come again, my father said. Thank you, the cop said again. Hopefully it won't be because you have been singing too loud for the neighbors. My father smiled and shrugged. Yes, you see, he said, we forget when we sing. The Iranians had something, to not only sing, but then to invite in a cop called to stop the singing and have him listen to more, albeit quieter singing. We were seeing something of their lives too. We were seeing how something hard could also have moments of being very easy. They started saying their elaborate goodbyes again, but we didn't joke about them. We were only kids, but we were starting to pay attention to what lasted and what did not. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Siamak. That was beautiful. It's almost like the secret lives of Iranians. So thank you all for doing these wonderful readings. And I liked, actually, I love how each of these pieces, actually like the entire book, brings together all these different aspects of that sense of belonging, and with all its intricacies and ambiguities and complexities. And also there's this constant sense I felt of a desire to keep that interior diversity, our interior diversity, alive, to sort of respect it and nourish it. And so I would like to, my first question, I'd like to sort of address it to all of you, and whoever wants to go first, you just have to unmute. And which is that when I was looking at this anthology and I was reading the pieces and your pieces, I thought, wow, like this, you know, this ideas of belonging and identity and diversity and so on, when you have to talk about it, of course, in the Iranian diaspora context, so many things could come up, right? You could think of so many things that could speak about this experience because it's one of our fundamental experiences. So, and especially the answers to these questions that are stated also in the introduction of the anthology. Am I Iranian? Am I American? Am I both? Am I in between? So I was wondering, how did you guys choose what to write about when you wanted to write about this anthology? How did you choose what piece could capture these complexities the best, and how you chose what to talk about, really? Whoever wants to go first.
I'll say probably of all of you who read, I'm the oldest, or one of the oldest, so my experience was without I didn't have a lot of context growing up because this was before the revolution, so there wasn't really a community. So in some ways I was intrigued as a child by my father's Iranian culture because he influenced a lot of the way that we managed our household, both in the food that we ate, the way that he raised us, but also there was this, you know, this sense in which something as simple as the aesthetics of how people looked was something that was acute in my childhood because there was nobody else growing up that was Iranian or Iranian American, which the term didn't even exist then. So I think when you're a kid, and I felt that also with yours, Siamak, that idea, like sometimes you don't have the language for something when you're a child, but you know it's important. You know that it's carrying a lot of symbolic weight. So for me, that idea of wanting to connect with my Iranian relatives, I couldn't speak Persian, but I wanted to be like some of the women because they were beautiful and they occurred to me in a certain way in my imagination. So that was what motivated.
That's amazing. Okay. Who's next?
I'll jump in. I think I'll just speak to where the piece came from itself. I had just finished writing this piece when the call went out for this anthology, but I want to shout out to editors because they're so generous. I mean, editors do so much for writers, and it's the invitation to write that's the gift. And I had an editor ask me to consider my relationship to Iran because I had started traveling there as an adult, and she said, "Could you write about it?" And and she had asked sort of for something straightforward narrative piece, and I thought I have no idea where to start, how to enter, because I was really entering something that had been part of my insides and part of my heart since I was a child, but I hadn't been there between 1975 and 2001. And so the piece itself is all about my trying to reconcile places and stories about places and memory and people. And there's a lot of family that was in Iran that welcomed me at that time, that really encouraged me to show up. And I was afraid and afraid of what they would think of me as an American, as an Iranian. And so traveling there was really was a journey. The writing is always about sort of asking the question, like, what is this? And there's always many questions, but it was really about what does this place continue to mean to me? And I was trying to answer some of that in this short lyric essay.
You know, it's interesting. I think growing up as a little kid, Iranians and my family, like they're such proud people. I find it's a common attribute in our culture. There's a lot of pride. And I felt that as a small child. I think little kids are extremely deeply intuitive and they pick up on so many things that are unspoken. And I think I would sense, especially with older people in my family, when we would go out in public and they would have to rely on me to act as an interpreter for them, or even if they were attempting to speak and communicate on their own and the sales clerk or the person across the counter would look and address me as ma'am and speak to me. There were these daily, maybe people call them microaggressions now, I call them indignities, that I witnessed, and I didn't have language or vocabulary for it at the time, but as a small child, you see all of that. And I think I immediately went to a place of wanting to talk about the people in my family, specifically the older people. I think Zahra is a very unique context. I think her situation has its own specific political and socioeconomic and gendered context that could be explored. But I immediately wanted to talk about the people around me who I saw as fully formed, three-dimensional, having agency, and explore that, because it's not something we see reflected. And I don't think the world around them was granting them or recognizing that.
Thanks for the question. I guess maybe what comes to mind first for me is that in choosing this topic, I mean, I gravitated towards being Iranian American as a youth, and specifically because that's such a interesting time to explore, and to in the course of writing it, I think I found I kind of felt like, you know, really what it was like for me was a sense that there was a constant reconciliation and a constant of the two cultures and a constant irreconciliation at once. And it's so dynamic a position to be in, you know, and sometimes when you're in it, you know, the tension of it overwhelms the beauty of it, I think, especially when you're young. But looking back, I'm really thankful for that state of uncertainty and questioning and wondering. You know, I think You know, which I'm still in, you know, in terms of what being Iranian American is still an undefined thing. But maybe because when you're young, you know, trying to figure out who you are is such a big question for everybody, that I appreciate how the cultural aspect of it gives that question some real form. So yeah, I think that's why I chose it.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's definitely dynamic, that's sense of uncertainty. I also wanted to just say that we're going to turn on the chat now. So if you guys have comments or questions, I still have my questions to ask. But if you, the audience, have comments, you want to just say bravo to the writers for the reading and so on, we're going to open it so you can write them down for now. Please don't turn on your mics just yet, but you can write them in the chat. And okay, so now I wanted to ask each of you a question more related to your piece, to your pieces specifically. So I'm going to start with Farnaz. Your piece, which was beautiful, it was this sort of collage of these beautiful glimpses of Iran when you went back, and I felt in it a sense of loss and confusion, and also a sense of wanting to reach out for something, maybe a sense of belonging, a sense of the past or something, but sense of reaching out to something. And when you do reach out, you turn the idea of belonging completely upside down. So it's not I belong to Iran, for instance, but that Iran owns me, which was something that was quite shocking to me. And I saw that sentence, I was like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. I'd never thought of it that way. So I wanted you maybe to talk a little bit more about that. What does that mean? What does that mean that Iran owns you? How far does it go? And is it something similar to a sense of belonging, or is it something completely different?
Wow, interesting question. I think it's different than the aspect of belonging. You know, the first thing that comes to mind is the colloquialism, you know, ownage. I think Iran owns me. It's got my number. And I think it's as a writer, I think it's like anything that continues to tug, those things that you go back to as themes, and Iran as a place is one thing, and the culture that my family gave me, or that I heard about, or that I knew about as a kid, is another thing. That it's not the place, it's the culture. The sort of tug to, when I was growing up, I didn't speak Farsi. I heard a lot of it, but didn't learn it until I was an adult. But now I have this impulse, if I make a meal and someone tells me how tasty it was, I want to say Nushujun. And the Iranians that are listening understand that. It's this impulse to, and I can't even translate it. It's like,
yeah, it's hard to translate.
That to me is ownage. It's not only the positives, but it's the tug. And I think that as the writers among us have those things, and it turns out, you know, the place and the people are going to be that for me. It's not going to stop. And as a child, I didn't understand enough. I didn't actually. Siamak is so articulate about it. I didn't understand that I had different parts of me warring against each other. I didn't understand that until I was an adult, and I didn't know enough to try to think about reconciliation or irreconciliation. So I think as a writer, I'm a writer because of that, because of all that uncertainty.
So it's almost like an impulse. Your Iranianness is almost like an impulse. Okay, thank you so much. My next question is for Persis. And well, of course, I think your piece made Me and a lot of people who were listening or reading smile more than a few times. You all kind of sort of touched our noses, and we know what you're talking about, you know, when looking at our own noses. And I know it was almost surreal, your piece, you know, this idea of this family, which is, was it a tradition? Was it a ritual? Was it a cult? I almost couldn't come up with a word of what it was, but whatever it was, you didn't want any of it. And so there is this strong sense of defiance, of course, in that piece. But what was even more interesting to me was that sense of authenticity that you desired so much. There was this sense of authenticity in the piece itself. It's like you're clinging on to that authentic self, and to just stay. It's as if you were saying, oh, but who will I be with my original nose? And I thought that word original nose was just so meaningful. And so I was thinking that in a way, you're almost, it's as if by this action, or by the refusing to this action, you're sort of choosing history and authenticity and originality over family. You're sacrificing that family ritual or cult or whatever it was. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that sense of authenticity. And in your complex background that you were just talking about, where does that authenticity stand? How do you define it when you look back at your background and who you are and who you were and what it all means?
Wow, that was great. What a great question, or what a great observation. You know, it's strange because I think on some deep, deep level, without having understood it or even having the language for it, I too felt a kind of pride at being Iranian, even though like I didn't grow up speaking Persian, but my dad was a very proud Iranian man, and he was very proud of the history of Iran, and he communicated that. Mostly he communicated it in the way that he talked about, you know, Iranian history sort of generally. He lived through the Second World War. He lived, you know, he was in the United States when the coup in '53 occurred, but I think he was very proud of the sort of resilience of Iranian culture. And to some degree, I also saw it as like this strange thing that people were westernizing. They were like literally making themselves Western and contorting their bodies to become Western. And I think at some like instinctual level, it bothered me that that was an expectation that women should have, that this idea of erasing something about their original features or whatever. And it was so comforting to me when my father kind of licensed me to make the choice for myself without pressuring me. And maybe it would have been different if I had an Iranian mother and had an Iranian mother who'd been subjected to, because most of the women in my family had a the plastic surgery. I think it was like this, it was very much a part of the fabric of Iranian culture in that time period. So even when people came here, they brought that sort of westernizing mentality to a lot of the aesthetics of, they didn't erase everything, but that was, it's like this public, at the end of the piece, I didn't read the whole thing obviously, but at the end of the piece, I comment on the idea of that the nose is the public display of one's true self, right? And in some ways,
map, you call it the
it's a relief map. And I kind of, in some ways now I associate that with a kind of my own instinctual pride at saying, I'm not going to become Western, even though I live here, I was born here. Because a little bit like what Siamak was saying, I felt like I was always negotiating some sense of that belonging to both cultures. And the idea of the nose job seemed almost like mutilation to me, right? A kind of literally cutting away something. So I mean, you kind of prompted me to think more deeply about it. I think it was a kind of gesture of pride that ultimately I didn't want to succumb to something that was the trend.
It was really amazing, especially because you were the most Western of them all, but they all wanted this Western image, and you sort of refused it. I just want to say I can ask so many questions of each of these authors, but unfortunately we don't have much time. So I'm going to the next author. Thank you, Persis. To Layla. Well, your piece was very personal and was very sweet and specific, and it almost felt to me like a tribute of love for this woman, who's not family, someone you call a servant in the piece, but who's like a third grandmother to you. But so, and it made me wonder, and it's all like told from the point of view of a child, and that was very sweet. I thought that was really sweet. And I thought to myself, I wonder, since your piece sort of refers to these social differences more clearly, more directly, let's say in an Iranian community or in an Iranian society, even on a bigger level, I was just wondering, like, how you feel that those class differences affects our sense of belonging to a geographical place. Because, you know, so many Iranians always say, oh, I would have never talked with that such and such person if I was in Iran. So there are all these things that we would have maybe never done, people we would have never been in touch with if, for example, we were in Iran. But it felt like those very clearly defined social status that were in Iran somehow became blurry once we came to the States. So I think basically my question is, like, where does like Zahra's experience and your family experience sort of merge in together once you come to the States? And do you think that sense of belonging, your sense of belonging, or a person's sense of belonging, is more to a specific social class of a society, or is it something like more broader, more inclusive?
Well, thank you for the question. It's deeply complex, and I don't know if I can do it full justice with the time we have, but a few things come to mind. I mean, first is there's this term I've heard from Angela Davis. I'm not sure who originally coined it. When we talk about the past and history and remembering, she talks about misremembering. And when I think about the immigrant experience, that word always comes to mind, because there is an extent to which, for those of us who were born in the United States, we have an image of an Iran that's frozen in time and that's a little bit flattened and two-dimensional. And there's a definite misremembering process. People are coming to this country and they may have left at a specific age. Being a young person and living in perhaps a prime or a very positive era of your life, or being a person of means, is going to color the way you look at the world. And so I think we have a definite case of misremembering. It only takes like a very precursory investigation of Iran's current political and economic situation to look at minorities and women's issues and refugees and immigrants. There was news just this week about how migrants are being treated in Iran. So I think there's a lot that can be unpacked there, and there is a definite disconnect into how an ethnic minority or religious minority who has immigrated from Iran is going to recall their time in the home country versus somebody who was part of the majority culture or part of the aristocracy or ruling class. But you're correct, there is a merging that happened for sure, because I think what was unique about my family's case is that Grandpa and my grandmother really kind of grew up together in a sense. They, when my grandmother went to her marital home, I think she was about 18 years old, and Zahra was also a teenager and came with her and, you know, helped her learn how to cook dishes. And they went through all these steps of life together. And what's very unique is they didn't part ways. They came to the US together, and she really did. I would introduce her to people here in the US as my grandmother. And so the lines do become very blurry. And I think especially as for the children, for my mother and her siblings, for myself, I think as we formed such close bonds to her, she called all of us her children and really viewed us as such. I think things start to shift, but it's also disingenuous to not acknowledge the economic circumstances that inform somebody's life decisions, because those are certainly there as well.
Thank you. It definitely reminded me of Roma, the movie. There's so much that love that's being sort of shared by this family and the woman. Thank you so much, Layla Jan. And so, okay, so for Siamak, my question is, I really liked your piece. I mean, I liked all the pieces, and I liked your piece especially because I know that singing, but that singing that all Iranians get together and do. And for me, it's actually very, it reminds me of childhood in Iran, because my parents' friends would always, at a certain point, they would dance, 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 then they would start singing. And there was that shift of happy to sad. And so there's also that sense of togetherness that's so beautifully captured. But I especially wanted to, I think what stood out to me in that beautiful piece was that sense of sadness, that shift to sadness. And because you said that you found the singing as a child sad, and you say that it felt as if like the Iranian, when you were with the Iranian community, there was this sort of space, this almost secret space for sadness and for failures, especially, which you didn't necessarily feel when you were in the American or with the American non-Iranian community. So I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more about that sadness. If you feel like the Iranian culture, in your experience, of course, the Iranian culture has a special place, or rather an inclination for sorrow, or actually for expressing sorrow, not just for sorrow, but for just expressing it. And if you feel like there is, in how you view it, a special relationship between Iranian culture and the concepts of sadness and grief and sorrow, and how we view it, how we express it, and how we accept it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing that jumps to mind for me is, as much as I did appreciate and felt moved by the singing that my parents and their friends would do at their get-togethers, I remember that when it was just me and my parents, when it was just our family, like on a road trip or something, and they would switch from whatever American music I was listening to whatever Iranian music they wanted to listen to. I would just be like sunk in a sadness from the music that I just couldn't understand why they wanted to go there, like on a car trip, you know? So it took a while, and a lot of that music still affects me in that way, which, you know, I want to get over because it's also beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I feel fortunate that, you know, that there is that connection within Iranian culture to expressions of sadness. You know, I think, yeah, and you hear it in the tones of the recitation of poetry. among Iranians. A kind of, yeah, sadness comes to mind for sure, a kind of nostalgia, you know, and then to add to that, the aspect of Iranian immigrants who are away from home, you know, on top of that, it was interesting because I felt like I knew a lot of the people, you know, that my parents were singing with, and I was sure that that there was so much that was different about the way they were experiencing sadness. And mostly what I'm referring to is because I knew that where my parents were coming from politically was different from where a lot of the people in the room were coming from politically. But I think that, you know, and then there's such a tie-in between like the poetry and the failures of individual failures, but also like the failure of seeing an Iran that many of us would want to see. But despite those differences, you know, this aspect of being away from home seemed to be like a singular, you know, like central point that they all had in common. And it was like a gathering place for all these different sadnesses. So I appreciated the rhythm, just like you're saying, of like there would be dancing at first, there would be like laughing and joyful singing, but you felt the arc of the night was always going to that same place. You know, it was always going to go to that same place, and I think it's good as a kid. You know, you learn to travel with that movement, and you learn a little bit about, you know, the fact that both of these emotions are part of life, and slowly, I think as a kid you learn that these are actually models for how to express both.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that sounds right about good to me. I definitely sense that also, because it's funny, we always say Iranians, we don't express our feelings. We never say I love you, we never say I'm sad, we never say, but at the same time we're like constantly this mountain of emotions always coming out of us, you know. Yeah. We don't really necessarily put it into words, but it's just so much there.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe like the idea is that there has to be a high artistic expression quality to it before it can be spoken.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Siamak. So I'm looking at our time and it's 6:10. Yeah, so although I have too many questions and I still wanted to ask one more, but I do want to go to our chat and see if anybody has any questions for our writers. Oh my God, there's a lot. Are there any questions? Has anybody spotted questions, or is anyone writing, or anybody has a question?
They seem to be mostly comments.
Yeah, I see a lot of comments. Yes,
but I don't see any questions per se.
So. Well, if anybody has, since we have another 20 minutes, I'll just control myself and I open it to the audience, and if anybody wants, oh, there, I saw it. So so we have two. The first one is, as Iranians, we have a huge tapestry of film, poetry, and prose to draw on to write creative nonfiction. How can we mix genres and art forms to tell true stories about ourselves, our families, our communities? Here's what everyone thinks, including Sahar, which is me. All right, who wants to go first?
I'll say something. I mean, I think that's what we're doing. I think that the aesthetic of Iranian culture is so strong in poetry and music, in visual arts and film. And to Sahar Gulshan, the person who asked the question, I think that one of the great things about what I've seen anyway, maybe I'll speak a little bit as somebody who's seen the arc of the storytelling, whether it's in poetry or prose or not, nonfiction, because I've sort of seen the changes since I edited that first collection. And one of the things that I see is that people are much more experimental now. And that also, when you say the word true stories, I think that it's a little bit like what Siamak was saying, is like, in some ways you have to grow out of some of the tension in order to be to tell some of the true stories. In other words, you have to have the maturity and the appreciation for that nuanced and balancing act. So I think it's happening, to answer your question, Sahar Gulshan, that we are mixing genres and we are telling true stories. And this collection, I think, represents certainly a part of that. And I would say, one more thing I would say is that when I edited the first collection, there was the kind of urgency of telling the first person story. And what I see now is an attention to fiction and the idea that it's hard to tell a true story, because in some ways we're always either trying to explain something, or we're also trying to avert that need to explain everything, you know?
Anyone else wants to add to that? Well, Persis pretty much summed it up, I'd say. Right, Sahar Gulshan? I think there was a lot. I mean, I think what I've always found important is you can basically pretty much do whatever you want, you know? You can mix anything you want, as long as, for me personally, you keep that emotional truth in your writing and in your art. And as long as that's there, then, you know, it could be a piece of poetry. I mean, like Persis's piece in this anthology begins with that piece, and then it ends with a poem. And Farnaz's piece could be read as a poem too. I mean, you know, who says it couldn't be? If she could just make the lines differently, and it would sound like, it sounded like a poem to me almost. So I think as long as you keep that, and as long as the facts that are historical, for example, you know, are true, and you don't make things up. If you want to talk about a certain very specific historical fact, then you're pretty much free, and that's what's great about being an artist, that freedom. All right, I'm going to go to the next question. Wait, I'm kind of confused. Okay, have you? Oh, what is, the first one is, what is the difference between anthology versus poetry? Well, they're two different things. Who wants to take that?
Well, an anthology is a collection,
Yeah,
by various authors. So this is a multi-author collection. And this happens to be an anthology of nonfiction, but there are anthologies of poetry as well.
everything, yeah. The next question is, have you preconceived notions of the Occidental world affected, oh wait, sorry, I can't even read anymore. Have your preconceived notions of the Occidental world affected your writing? Interesting, preconceived notions. Who would like to take that? So, authors, Farnaz, John, yeah?
I take the question seriously, but it's almost impossible to answer that. I think, I'm sure they have. I'm sure they have. And I think that one of the ways is as sort of thinking, do I belong to, you know, who am I? Am I from the East? Am I from the West? Where do I fit? That's one way they certainly affected me as a writer. And so thinking of my first 10 years were in suburban Long Beach, California, and then 8 in the in Santa Monica. And there are all kinds of things that I thought I was expected to be or do. And so as a writer, I'm sure it's a lifetime of unpacking those things, but also unpacking what I expect from readers, what I expect from other writers and the community that I'm part of. So it's a really interesting question, but really hard to answer. So thanks for it.
Anybody else wants to add anything about our authors?
I don't know how well this answers the question, but I think my preconceived notion of the Occidental world was that I had to write like they wrote in the Occidental world, basically. And that's those were my models, you know, those were my examples, and I appreciate that, you know. I think there's, you know, a wonderful literary tradition in the Occidental world. But I think, you know, the ongoing project for me personally is to figure out the ways that figure out what I want to let in and what I don't want to let in, and figure out what I want to take from that tradition, and what I also want to take from the world, the Oriental world as well.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback off that, it's worth mentioning, just because it hasn't come up yet in the conversation, many of the pieces employ code switching. So you see us slip in and out of Farsi terms and phrases. And I think that's one solid example of how a lot of us have unpacked or unlearned, to use Farnaz's term, what we were raised with, right? The American literary tradition. And there's a whole series of really skillful English language authors who've kind of paved the way, right? I'm thinking of people like Gloriane Saldua, who've given us these shining examples of how you can play with language and reinvent it. Because I think for me, I want it to feel honest and authentic and true to my lived experience, which really couldn't exist and like it be told effectively in one language alone.
Thank you so much, Layla. Very true. I'm going to look at our chat. Okay, are there hopes and or plans to reach out to educators at high school or college level to promote this anthology in creative writing courses and or culture studies courses? Who would like to tell us more about that?
Well, I'm gonna speak for the two editors unless they can talk themselves. Can they talk?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, Catherine or Layla, do you want to say anything about that since you're...
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you all. To see you and to have you speak, to hear you read your stories. In terms of distribution, we would love it to be in more, as many classrooms as possible. And that was one of the things that Layla and I thought of when we were first pulling this together, that it would be really good to be a text in high schools and universities. And the fact that it's published by University Press, I think, aids that mission. And, you know, we're just trying, and Siamak's sister hosted a reading with high school kids last Sunday, which was phenomenal. So we're trying to kind of get it out there in as many ways as we can. There's an English teacher in my neighborhood who is planning on using it, and she teaches in a school in the East Bay public high school, so she's planning on using it. So I think that we'll try to do it as much as we can, and anyone that you all, this collective group, anything that you can do to help that, that would be great. But I think would be a really important text. So thanks.
Okay.
Can I add one thing? One of the things that I think is so valuable about anthologies is that they are multivocal, multicultural, as Sahar, you pointed out at the beginning, there are many variations of belonging to this diaspora, and Catherine is one of them also, because she's married to an Iranian and she has half Iranian children. And increasingly, I think, under Trump's leadership of this country, people have begun to feel that even if you're like have never been to Iran or you don't speak Persian, your identity is being more markedly pronounced now than ever before. And so one of the things that I think is so great about this collection is that it's also showing a more diverse experience of what that Iranian diaspora looks like. So it's not just people who came from Iran in relatively recent history, but also people who were born and raised here. And I think anthologies are in some ways a gift to all of us as writers, because they're things that we can point to that are not necessarily our experience. Like Farnaz, I was really touched by your piece because, of course, I've never been able to go to Iran because I have a very complicated biography and I won't get into it. But you know, the idea that just because I haven't been to Iran doesn't mean I can't be in some ways owned by some of the same kinds of feelings that you express. So I think just to sort of echo the question that Susie Whitney asked, is that now more than ever, we need that kind of diverse representation. And I think arts and literature in particular are very valuable ways to educate people about the complexity of a culture like Iran that's been so reduced to these awful news headlines. And Sahar, your book, of course, is an example of that as well.
Thank you, Persis. Yeah, I think what I especially love about this anthology is how democratic it is. Like everyone has a say, and it just in so many ways challenges that idea of a single story, that there is no single story and there's no single identity, and everything is a lot more complex than we'd like it to be. And maybe that's where its beauty lies as well. So I think, yeah, definitely for high schools, colleges, anybody who can read it. I mean, it was eye-opening for me, who's an Iranian and, you know, was born in Iran and raised in Iran, and you know, maybe like don't have some of these questions maybe don't come up in my daily life, but it was just so amazing to see how beautiful it is that there is a piece of Iran. There's that Iran that's living and breathing and laughing and crying and all of that, and somewhere in the world, and there's all these little pieces of it everywhere around the world with us and whoever has been in contact. So I thought that was just so beautiful, and how you captured it in the anthology was amazing. I don't know how long we have. I think we have maybe one more question we can take from the audience. Okay. We're imagining, and who was the audience for your stories? No, wait. Were you imagining who was the audience for your stories as you were writing? So a question on if you knew who the audience is. Take it away, whoever wants to go first.
I try not to imagine too much who the audience is, because I think it leaves it open, and it leaves it you know, it leaves it open so that folks on different parts of a spectrum can feel like they can be open to either learning if it's something that's new to them, or like perhaps hopefully like agreeing or understanding if it's something familiar to them. So, you know, there's going to be so many different types of responses that I guess the most I would say is, for me personally, I just try to imagine that the reader is somebody who is open and willing to make the effort to understand, regardless of where they're coming from.
Anyone else? wants to talk about audience, specific audience in mind?
I mean, I wrote very specifically for Zahra. Zahra is her legal name. We all called her by a nickname at home, and I was so conscious of this is a person who is not here anymore, and I can't ask and get her permission. And so, and she was quite opinionated, and if she were here, she would let me know what she thinks of it. And so she was really my sole focus through and through.
I think actually, Layla, that's a good point. I think in some strange way, we're always writing for the people we're writing about. You know, for me, like especially if the people who I'm writing about are happy with it, I feel like I've succeeded. So there's no other audience. I think deep down, probably that's what happens. I don't know if it feels the same for you guys too.
No, you just look.
Yes, it does. And also I want to share with the audience your lovely novel as well, Sahar. Sahar is a very talented novelist, and her first novel, Children of the Jacaranda Tree, I know you have similar attachments, and it shares your family's story of the experiences you've gone through. So I highly want to recommend that and give it a plug as well. Since you're too humble to give the plug, I'll make it for you. Anybody who's interested and moved by the stories they heard today, I think would be supremely interested in that book as well.
Thank you, Layla John. Merci. Okay. We have 3 more minutes, but I actually, let's see if there is a question that could be answered quickly, because otherwise we probably wouldn't have time. There's lots of thank yous, and we have only 10 minutes. Any recommendations? Okay. Well, I wanted to say before if there are no more questions, I'd like to make a few reminders before I let everybody go. The first thing is, well, the anthology. Please buy it, support it, you'll love it. It's called My Shadow is My Skin, and you can, you're getting all the links down there. So from bookshop.org or Books Inc. or Amazon, anywhere you'd like to purchase it, you can. And also, if you liked this reading, if you liked what you heard today, there are 2 more readings coming up with the other authors of the anthology. So there's one more on Saturday the 16th at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and Saturday the 23rd at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I don't know if that's going to be also written there. That would be good. So Saturday 16th and Saturday the 23rd. And that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and listening. And thank you, our authors. I didn't get to ask all my million other questions, but it will be for next time. And thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great job. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this day with me, guys.
Oh yes, happy birthday, Persis. It's Persis' birthday.
It was fun. It was really nice.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sahar. You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You guys were amazing. I hope you all had fun, and come to the next two readings, okay? And get the book.
Yes.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Tavallud Mubarak.
Thank you to Dana and Roya, too.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dana and Roya.
Managing this.